The river does not give easily. It swallows without haste, folds secrets into silt, and waits until someone stubborn enough drags the water with a magnet. In 2006, a man standing at the edge of a quiet bank felt his rope tighten against something that refused to sink. What rose was no coin, no rusted hook, but a single key, its teeth chewed by years of current, its brass dulled into the color of old bone. A tag dangled from it, stamped with a code that no one could place, as if language itself had been eroded. He kept it, puzzled, slipping it into a tackle box where hooks and line rattled against its quiet weight. For him it was nothing more than a curiosity, the kind of fine magnet fishers brag about and then forget. But time has its own design. Before his final illness, he pressed the box into his son's hands, telling him to keep what mattered and discard the rest. The key survived again, carried forward almost by accident, until it arrived in mine. It waited patiently, as if it knew its story was not finished. When I first held it, the metal was cold despite the heat of the day. Its ridges fit too easily against the memory that has haunted my family for decades. 1987, the year my uncle vanished without explanation. He had been an officer with the Federal Investigation Agency, steady in his work, meticulous at home. Then one evening he did not return, and the silence that followed became a second parent, raising me, shaping the air we breathed, reminding us that truth can disappear more completely than flesh. Now, in my palm, two timelines pressed together, the year of his disappearance and the year the river tried to return something. Absence against artifact, water against steel. It felt less like coincidence than invitation, and beneath the weight of the key, I heard the old question harden into a vow. Which locker held the answer? The case file speaks in a language. Age of authority, typed sheets, orderly margins, and the final stamp that delivered its verdict, accidental loss. Officially, my uncle drowned in 1987, claimed by the river he crossed every evening on his way home. The report framed it neatly, almost comfortingly, as if grief could be softened by administrative certainty. But certainty is fragile. It shatters the moment you hold a key that should not exist. The tag bore a code. Neat, punched characters that resembled an address stripped of its city, a map missing its compass. At first it seemed nonsensical, but when I placed the metal before experts, the certainties of the file began to unravel. A locksmith studied the grooves, his thumb running across their worn ridges. He frowned, noting the pattern belonged to a locker series discontinued before the late 1980s, the sort rarely found in ordinary stations by then. To him, it was an orphaned relic, something that had no business turning up in 2006, decades after its parent line vanished from circulation. That was only the beginning. A retired station manager, drawn by curiosity and a trace of memory, examined the tag. He recognized the blocky font, the industrial cut of the numbering plate. It stirred familiarity, yet he swore he had never seen that specific coding scheme in any depot under his watch. His certainty made the object stranger still, a thing both known and alien, close enough to the ordinary to pass unnoticed, yet ultimately unclaimed by the world it should have belonged to. Then an archivist, sifting through brittle catalogs in a municipal warehouse, uncovered an advertisement from the mid-1980s. A private chain, largely forgotten, had leased parcels of storage under the bland promise of secure left luggage solutions. Their bays were arranged in quadrants, each numbered by code rather than location, a system designed to be anonymous, discreet, almost yet invisible. The photograph in the advertisement showed gleaming rows of lockers, doors shut like secrets waiting for the right hands to unlock them. And suddenly the tag on my uncle's key was no longer random. It was a coordinate in a vanished map. That discovery tilted the ground beneath me. The official story painted a man lost to the river, the simplest tragedy. Yet here was an object insisting on design, a breadcrumb deliberately dropped into the future. If my uncle prepared a stash, if he left behind something to be claimed not by family but by strangers dragging magnets through water, then what had he truly been preparing for? The paradox was unbearable. He had been protector, mentor, almost a second father, a man of duty and meticulous order. Why would he choose to leave us blind while arranging for unknown others to find the trail? The contradiction cut deeper than grief. It was not just death versus survival, but trust against betrayal, love against obligation. To confront it, I had to step out of the silence that had kept his name safe but suffocated. I chose to go on record, not merely as a journalist but as his niece, promising to say his name aloud while I followed the thread he left behind, a thread that might unspool everything we thought we knew about our family. The last 12 hours of my uncle's life read like two overlapping scripts. On paper, he was an officer on routine assignment, expected home before nightfall. In memory, he was a man who lingered too long at his desk, locking the drawer twice as if one turn of the key wasn't enough. He phoned 2 colleagues that afternoon, men whose names would later resurface in whispered rumors, but said nothing unusual to them. A corridor camera that might have traced his final steps was, conveniently, not working. By the time the official narrative was stamped, those gaps had already hardened into a bedtime story for the grieving. He must have slipped, drowned, lost too soon to chance. But uncertainty does not dissolve so easily. I reopened notebooks I had once abandoned, their margins heavy with answered questions. I filed right to information requests, requesting brittle files that smelled of dust and denial. What surfaced was less a single revelation than a constellation. Between 1986 and 1988, the same names repeated across investigations into smuggling routes and customs corruption. Inspectors reassigned with no explanation. Informants found dead in alleys, their cases quickly sealed. Ledgers that vanished from evidence rooms. And within this turbulence, my uncle's disappearance was not unique but orbiting. One more body pulled into the same dark gravity. 2 weeks before he vanished, he had filed a memo requesting an undercover extension. Officially, the request was denied, the paper clipped neatly into the record. Unofficially, colleagues hinted he continued the work anyway, stepping past orders into silence. That detail split the story in two: the dutiful officer swallowed by accident, and the investigator who chose danger rather than abandon a thread of corruption too tangled to ignore. Both stories were told. Only one could be true. Flashbacks pressed against my notes. I remembered him carefully saving receipts in a tin box, folding each slip into neat halves as though order itself could protect him. I remembered him crouching to feed stray dogs outside our gate, gentleness disguised as routine. And I remembered his briefcase, always close, always locked, a boundary even those closest to him could not cross. Those images, tender in their ordinariness, now felt like prophecy. He was a man preparing for something unseen, shielding us without telling us why. The contrast grew sharper with each page, the official truth, sterile and convenient, versus the intimate observations that refused to align. My grief had once accepted the bedtime story because it was easier than staring at absence, but the key in my hand, and the braided evidence surrounding it, forced me to ask a question I dreaded. If he had a locker, then he may have chosen distance not only from the agency that failed him, but from the family he loved. To finish his work, he might have believed he had to vanish. That thought, scratched into the margins of my notes, unsettled me more than any file ever could. And yet it pulled me forward, because lies, whether told by institutions or by memory, do not remain intact forever. The tag looked ordinary. 2 letters, a hyphen, 2 digits, another letter. But patterns speak if you give them time. I carried it first to a locksmith whose trade had drifted into archiving. He ran his thumb across the stamped surface, then the worn grooves of the key itself, and explained that obsolescence leaves fingerprints. The style of stamping, the spacing, even the depth of the letters spoke of a system retired decades ago. To him, it belonged to a locker network erased not by design flaws but by the simple passage of time. A metalworker studied the alloy under his lamp, tilting it to catch faint etchings hidden beneath oxidation. He dated the steel's temper, noting how water had bitten but not broken it. Mid-80s, he said with quiet certainty. Industrial, made to last. That survival carried weight. The key had endured because it was meant to. The final voice came from a historian of the obscure, a man who collected transit tokens, ticket stubs, and forgotten pamphlets. When I placed the tag before him, his eyes brightened with recognition. "City left luggage," he murmured. A franchise that once leased locker banks to train stations and ferry terminals, thriving on anonymity until it quietly folded. Its codes followed a strict pattern: location, bay, locker number, quadrant. Together, we triangulated. From a yellowed franchise ledger salvaged during a municipal auction, the concordance was clear. CL27C pointed to Central Terminal's West Concourse, Bay C, Locker 27, active between 1986 and 1989. Suddenly, the string of letters and numbers was no longer abstract but geographic, a map back into the world that my uncle had inhabited. Crossing the threshold meant more than finding coordinates. It meant prying open a sealed part of the city and admitting aloud what I had resisted. I would follow this thread even if it unraveled my mother's fragile peace. Central Terminal's West Concourse was shuttered, ringed by chain link awaiting redevelopment. When I stepped through a gap in the fence, the air changed, colder, heavier, layered with dust and echoes of footsteps that no longer belonged. Safety gave way to danger, permission to trespass, the neat lines of a ledger dissolving into grime under my shoes. Then my phone vibrated. An unknown number lit the screen, and a voice I didn't recognize delivered a single warning: "Leave the dead alone." The words steadied rather than stopped me. If the dead had nothing left to say, the living would not be so afraid. Bilal had never imagined himself inside anyone's mystery. In 2006, he was just another man on the riverbank, hauling magnets through murky water for the small thrill of salvage. On an old forum thread, half broken in the archives of the early internet, his presence lingers. A username, a grainy photograph of a key resting against his palm, his knuckles scraped raw from rope burn. The caption is almost careless: "Cool find from the riverbend." That faint digital breadcrumb is all I have until I track down his son. He works as a mechanic, his speech blunt and shaped by the rhythm of tools. In the corner of his garage office sits a battered tackle box. When he sets it on the desk, he handles it with a reverence that feels closer to ritual than hobby. The hinges groan as it opens, spilling the clutter of years, lead weights, bent nails, coins fused together by rust. And there, lying as if it had been waiting, is the key. The son's voice slows as he recounts his father's story. A line had snagged on something that resisted, heavy, enough to strain the rope, reluctant to rise. Inch by inch, the magnet brought it up, dripping weeds and silt, until the sunlight caught a dull gleam. The tag's stamped code puzzled Bilal, who turned it over in his hands before debating aloud. Should he deliver it to police or keep it as a curiosity? In the end, curiosity won. The key went into the tackle box, carried silently through the rest of his life. As we talk, the son hesitates, then admits something he has never written or told. Once, years earlier, he carried the key to the bus depot. A row of public storage lockers stood against the wall, and he tried the key for a laugh, half hoping it might click. None of the locks turned. The experiment was abandoned, dismissed as a boy's mischief, but his confession lingers like a shadow between us. It tells me something more than he realizes. The city was once riddled with overlapping systems, stations, depots, and privately leased locker banks, each coded differently, each capable of swallowing objects whole. His embarrassment colors the memory, but beneath it I hear the unspoken rhythm of all these stories: trust against doubt, civic responsibility against human curiosity. Bilal chose silence. His son chose confession. Between them, the key survived, drifting like flotsam until it reached me. When I leave the garage, the box is closed again, but the son presses the key into my hand. Its metal is cool, stubborn, carrying the weight of years it has already endured. I walk away feeling not only the burden of the object but the debt of time, the long silence it took for the river's offering to surface. The municipal archive breathed of mildew and dust, a place where paper outlived memory by sheer stubbornness. The clerk, practiced in the art of patience, slid a cardboard box across the counter. Its label was unremarkable: left luggage, private franchise, 1985 to 1991. But inside, the ordinariness cracked. Lease contracts curled at the edges, inspection sign-offs stamped in dull purple ink, all the bureaucratic traces of a business long forgotten. And buried between them, the prize, a single sheet of paper, handwritten, almost overlooked. The inventory listed locker assignments in a careful script, but its survival was almost accidental. On the back, A bored auditor had sketched looping doodles, flowers crowding the margins like a secret signature. That frivolity had spared the sheet from disposal, keeping alive what the system tried to erase. And there it was, clear in black ink. C, Bay C, number 27, reserved nightly, cash, renter code, MN12, temporary. The dates aligned with the final months of my uncle's life, the weeks when silence thickened into disappearance. The revelation fractured the story anew. The renter code was no random sequence. In intelligence work, such designations suggested compartments, units within units, information sealed off to limit exposure. MN12 could have been an alias, or worse, a designation marking him as one piece in a wider machinery. It meant my uncle was not merely acting alone. He had either partners or watchers, shadows moving in parallel. The marginal notes deepened the unease. An inspector's hurried scrawl mentioned a man with a light limp, seen alongside the renter at least once. The description was bland, functional, yet it pierced through. Someone had been there, close enough to be noticed, trained enough to vanish into the folds of the ordinary. Whether ally or handler, their presence rewrote the loneliness I had always imagined into something more complicated. The ledger made silence sing. Each line carried more than data, it carried implication. My uncle, the man who saved receipts with ritual precision and locked his briefcase like a fortress, had been operating within a framework larger than our family could have conceived. If he was MN12, then he was also a fragment of an operation designed to survive even its own erasure. The contrast shifted, no longer a tale of good men against corrupt ones, but of loyalty set against survival, of institutions that demand sacrifice against the individuals who try to make them bearable, and the sheet itself bore scars. Along its edge the paper was blackened, curling inward like the lip of a wound. Char marks traced its border as if the page had survived fire, or worse, an attempt to make memory flammable. Someone had tried to consign it to oblivion, yet here it was, delivered into my hands by accident and persistence. I stared at the words until they blurred, the ink pulling me backward into my uncle's careful steps, his locked drawers, his secret briefcase. If he was MN12, he had chosen to disappear into code, to become a designation rather than a name. And with that realization came the ache of a second loss. The man we loved was perhaps never fully ours, but partly theirs, already claimed by an institution that spoke in numbers and silence. The central terminal concourse no longer exists, its tiled corridors gutted into echo and scaffolding. Yet lockers, I learn, migrate like weathered bones. Through a facilities contractor who has seen too many renovations to care about nostalgia, I discovered that when the terminal was overhauled in 1992, entire banks of storage units were uprooted, sold off in bulk to a wholesaler, and redistributed piecemeal. Some landed in suburban stations, others in ferry waiting rooms, a handful in a private depot across the river. The code's neat geography collapses in an instant. Bay C, Locker 27, might no longer belong to the concourse that birthed it. Its faceplate could front a hallway half a city away. The trail demands paperwork, and paperwork demands authority. With a court order and the wary blessing of a facilities manager, I follow serial numbers through ledgers stamped with bureaucratic weariness until they lead to a warehouse on the edge of the city. Inside, the air is metallic and still. Retired lockers stand in regimented rows, gray doors repeating like headstones. Each one bears the scars of transit, scratched paint, gum hardened into faucets. L's tags half-peeled. They feel less like furniture than mausoleums, each compartment a chamber of someone else's forgotten moment. And there it is, C27. Its door has survived, though the body it belonged to is gone, bolted instead onto a mismatched frame. The number plate looks unchanged, indifferent to decades of shifting walls. I kneel before it, twist the key, and feel the metal turn with reluctant obedience. The door creaks open to reveal a shallow cubby layered in dust. Old chewing gum clings stubbornly to the corners, the remnants of travelers who once waited with nothing but time to waste. For a moment it looks like emptiness. Then my fingertip catches on a seam at the back, an edge where none should exist. The false panel yields only when I press hard along its rim, the metal flexing just enough to betray its secret. Behind it lies a space no larger than a handspan, but large enough to matter. Inside rests a thin envelope fused by moisture to the steel, its paper warped into fragile waves. I slide it free and find two relics sealed in its ruin: a water-warped train stub dated the night of my uncle's disappearance, and a Polaroid photograph. The stub is faint but legible, proof that someone had carried it deliberately into hiding. The Polaroid, by contrast, startles. A picture of a different locker bank, the numbering system strange, marked with letters instead of digits. I recognize the style from archives, a safe deposit wing once owned by a defunct bank, long since dissolved. The photograph is not merely a clue, but a redirection, a signpost pointing beyond luggage toward something built for secrecy and wealth. The moment lands with the weight of confession. The locker we were meant to find was never only a storage space for bags or tickets. It was camouflage, a doorway into a deeper system of hiding. Silence versus revelation has become a hinge, swinging me from the comfort of narrative into the sharp edge of uncertainty. The question tightens, sharper than before. Which locker is the locker, and how many more doors must open before the truth steps forward? The moment the false back surrendered its paper ghosts, the warehouse stopped feeling like a warehouse. Temperature isn't supposed to change in a building sealed with corrugated tin and buzzing fluorescent lights, but it did. Air that had been merely stale now pressed heavier, carrying the charge of an old battery. My palms knew it before my head did. We had crossed some invisible threshold. That night, the message arrived. A plain email, one sentence long, from what looked like an investigator's office I had corresponded with 2 weeks earlier. The address was identical except for a single letter dropped into the middle of the surname, a trick of typography you could miss if you weren't squinting. No signature, no greeting, just, "Not every door should be opened." The timing wasn't random. 2 evenings later, the front tire on my car sighed flat halfway through a side street I never parked on. Not a blowout, not a nail, just the perfect hiss of something let out with precision. I changed it under the sodium light, hyper-aware of shadows. And when I finally trudged back to my apartment, key in hand, the door handle bore fresh scratches, a quick tug against the deadbolt paint. Somebody had tested the lock, or wanted me to know they had. This isn't a manual about counter-surveillance. I won't pretend to lecture on safe houses or spycraft. What matters is sensation, the way pressure accumulates in a body before thought. Your chest stiffens. A hum rises under your ribs as though weather itself had crawled inside. You start watching your own reflection in shopfront glass, not for vanity, but for confirmation that the street behind you is still empty. Paranoia, if you let it run, will map a city for you. I decided not to run alone. The first call was to a colleague, someone fluent in the labyrinth of archival databases, a person who knows how to coax useful fragments from reels of bureaucratic microfilm. The second call went to a lawyer, steady, deliberate, allergic to drama, who agreed to petition for limited access to the bank's defunct records. The third was to a locksmith with more gray hair than patience, a man who carried the quiet pride of someone who'd spent 40 years picking and repairing without once being accused of tampering. His promise was simple. I won't touch a thing without court oversight. If you want to do this clean, we do it slow. Those anchors mattered, because my uncle, the uncle who had vanished in 1987, was no longer presenting himself in my mind as a mere casualty. The evidence whispered otherwise. That stub, that Polaroid, the deliberate false back, none of it aligned with a passive disappearance. The story was turning, against my will, into something harsher. A man on offense who miscalculated, a move that wasn't meant to end in a disappearance but in control. And yet, the control was not mine. Nights grew louder. I started noticing headlights in my rearview mirror that refused to pass even on empty stretches of highway. Maybe they belonged to an insomniac commuter, or maybe not. The human brain doesn't need confirmation to trigger adrenaline. My fingers dug into the steering wheel, pulse syncing with the thrum of tires. Rear-view glass turns every unknown driver into an accomplice. Fear alone would have been enough, but fear plus stubbornness is a different creature. I felt both. If pressure was weather, then stubbornness was bedrock. The Polaroid helped. Amid all the noise, a small, practical miracle. In the glossy surface of that old snapshot, you could see the faintest reflection of a window. Tilted just so, reversed like script in a mirror, the window's glass had captured letters, the name of a bank branch spelled backward, not a symbol, not a metaphor, a real-world place, a point on a map where fiction ended and pavement began. Even paranoia needs coordinates, even dread demands a compass, and so I found myself with one. I had been preparing to march toward the bank like it was the inevitable final step in a long equation. But before I crossed that line, I sat down with my mother. She listened the way she always had when I was young and trying to bend the truth. Head slightly tilted, lips pressed together, as if she could hear not just my words but the omissions between them. I laid it all out: the locker key, the Polaroids, the false-back trunk, the paranoia building in stairwells and parking lots. When I finished, she didn't answer. She just left the room. A moment later, she returned with a yellowed envelope, so brittle at the corners it looked like it had been waiting for this conversation. My uncle's handwriting curled across the front. The date: 2 weeks before he disappeared. Inside was a single line, scrawled like a man who had no time to explain. If you find a key, it means I failed at something else. That one sentence tilted the entire story on its axis. The key wasn't just a breadcrumb, it was a confession in code. He didn't trust that he would live long enough to close the loop. And worse, he didn't trust us not to go looking. My mother's silence broke into a quiet admission. There had always been whispers. A rumor that he hadn't just been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. That he had bent the rules. Not for greed, exactly. Not like a bribe stuffed in a briefcase under a table. But something stranger, sadder. Money that was supposed to move a witness into hiding, safe house, relocation, new identity, was allegedly routed through him when the agency froze accounts. Somewhere in the shuffle, cash went missing. Not all of it, maybe not even much, but enough to spark a question no one wanted to answer out loud. Did he pocket some of it? Did he buy himself time? Did he build a shield out of someone else's safety net? And if he did, was that corruption or desperation? The questions slithered across our kitchen table like smoke. Every answer, split into 2 more, each darker than the last. I wanted to defend him, to keep him framed in the light, a man outnumbered but not compromised. But my mother's eyes, wet, heavy, tired, made me pause. She loved her brother more than anyone, but she knew the math of survival. And in that math, even the best people sometimes make choices that can't be explained, only endured. This was no longer about finding a missing man or cracking a safety deposit box. It had turned into a ledger, a moral account book where love and judgment collided on the same page. If I opened that locker, I wasn't just opening a container. I was prying open a version of my uncle I might not want to meet. Maybe he had been a victim. Maybe he had been a player. Maybe both could be true. The metal key burned in my palm like it knew the answer already. My mother reached across the table, set her hand on mine, and whispered the closest thing to permission she could muster. "Go," she said, "but remember, whatever you find, it belongs to him, not to us." Her reluctant blessing weighed more than her refusal ever could have, because now I wasn't just chasing ghosts. I was trespassing in the last version of the man she still wanted to believe in. And still, I decided to keep going. The building doesn't look like a bank anymore. It wears its decline like a stubborn illness, granite facade, soot-blackened, brass door frames dulled to the color of dried mustard. A newer institution swallowed it after the collapse of the 90s, and most of the marble counters inside were stripped for salvage. But the vault remained, mothballed, sealed into the basement like a lung that never exhaled. Getting this far had taken 3 weeks of correspondence, a lawyer's hand steadying mine, and a court order so narrowly tailored it felt like threading a needle in the dark. Even then, the archivist, an archivist, not a banker, looked at me with a suspicion that suggested personal inconvenience ranked higher than legal compulsion. She loved rules more than sleep, and she insisted on reciting every one before she would even touch the key ring on her belt. When at last she relented, the elevator groaned us down 2 stories into cool air that smelled of graphite, old wool, and the faint tang of mold. The vault gate loomed ahead, a mesh of iron ribs as thick as my wrist. With a crank of the wheel and the mechanical roll of tumblers disengaging, it opened not with drama, but with a weary sigh, like a house that had been waiting too long to be entered. The locksmith worked under her hawk's gaze. His tools made patient, incremental noises, the delicate scrape of metal teeth adjusting, the compressed hiss of air from his lungs as he leaned into precision. The drawer gave way all at once, sliding free with the ungraceful clatter of silverware dumped into a sink. Box number 117, its digits matching the blurred reflection I'd once studied in a Polaroid, was in my hands. It was lighter than I expected, lighter but not empty. Inside, things were nested like Russian dolls. A micro-cassette recorder, its plastic yellowed but intact. A ring with 3 smaller keys, each cut with a different pattern of teeth. A folded ledger page, names in a cramped hand alongside numbers that could have been payments or debts. And a sealed letter, its envelope thick, the address written in block capitals, MN12. The archivist stepped back, folding her arms as though to declare her neutrality. My hands shook with an intimacy I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just evidence, it was my uncle pressing through the decades to stage direct my arrival. I started with the tape. A second-hand player, loaned from the locksmith who apparently collected antique tech, swallowed the cassette with a soft click. When I pressed play, his voice came out thinner than memory, but steadier than I wanted it to be. "If you're hearing this," he said, "you already know the official story won't match the private one. The sting was compromised. A handler I trusted changed the meeting location. Backup was late, maybe by design. I was left exposed. I needed an alternate path, a shadow trail, one nobody would check." He coughed, cleared his throat, then continued. "The locker was never meant for me to reclaim. I threw my original key into the river because sometimes you force fate to pick the finder. If you found it, you've already risked more than you should. Listen carefully. Don't tether your story to me. Tie it to the record, to the facts. My name isn't the safeguard. The record is." The tape hissed and clicked to a stop. In the silence, I unfolded the ledger. Each line was a collision of implication. Names I recognized from old news clippings, numbers large enough to change lives or end them. Some entries were crossed out, others underlined, and at the bottom, in handwriting darker and more decisive than the rest, a single phrase, 3 keys, 3 locks, not all mine to open. The ring of small keys rattled in my hand. They seemed almost theatrical, as if meant less for utility than for symbol, proof of access withheld or responsibility distributed. Finally, the envelope. The archivist shook her head sharply. "Not here. Not in my vault." She meant it. Rules and rituals again. So I slid it back, still sealed, into my bag. Walking out, I felt less like I had uncovered answers than like I had inherited a burden carefully engineered to survive him. The penultimate turn wasn't clarity. It was a test, duty versus love, legacy versus survival. And I hadn't yet chosen which side I stood on. The tape is not a revelation so much as a recalibration. What once hovered as rumor now condenses into testimony. Names of men who in the 80s were still small operators, couriers in creased suits, and who later reappeared as respectable figures with pensions and plaques. My uncle does not linger on their sins. He sketches movements, times, transfers, and a single altered meeting that set the sting adrift. The recorder captures not outrage but resignation, a steady cadence like a man trying to teach rather than confess. It is both less and more than I imagined. Less because it does not hand us villains wrapped in ribbons. More because it points toward a machinery of compromise where the gears were already turning, indifferent to who was ground down. His words do not exonerate him, but neither do they damn him. They situate him in a chain of flawed decisions where duty, doubt, and desperation braided too tightly to separate. We carry it forward, brittle ribbon and all, to the authorities. Not because we expect indictments, statutes have long expired, but because even in 2025, an old tape can still amend a file. A witness once branded unreliable gains posthumous credibility. A sidelined report regains its paragraph. A man dismissed as deserter is nudged back into the ledger as casualty. These are small repairs, but they matter. In archives, truth accretes by inches, and this is another inch. At home, I sit with my mother, the last listener he could not imagine but perhaps hoped for. We play the closing minute, his voice thinning as if the tape itself grows tired. "Forgive me," he says, not as plea, but as punctuation. He does not ask to be understood, only to be remembered without bitterness. My mother weeps without language. I weep with too much of it. Between us sits the recorder, an oracle that has delivered its final prophecy. The choice we face is quiet, to publish, to file, to let others draw their own maps from his words. We choose all three. Justice, at this distance, does not look like punishment. It looks like acknowledgement, like a correction in the margins that keeps a story from vanishing altogether. I meet the magnet fisherman's son by the river and return his father's fragment of the chain. He accepts it not as relic but as role. He is no longer a bystander. He is stitched into the record, part of how the story survived. When we step back, the river is unchanged. Sam, current, same glitter under sun. But the difference is within us. Suspicion tempered into testimony, grief folded into lineage, myth reconciled with record. The tide carries on, and so, in altered form, do we. In the end, which locker lingers as more than a logistical query. It is two questions braided into one. Which metal box once held the evidence that slipped through official hands, and which hidden chamber within us holds the version of history we choose to carry forward? The physical locker may one day be traced, matched to an inventory log or a retired officer's fading memory. But the second locker, the private one, the internal vault of memory and compromise, is where the truer battle lies. The tape has done its work. It opened a seam, not wide enough to swallow every question, but enough to let light pass through. The next steps are practical and human, pressing for transparent archiving so no more families wait decades for crumbs, supporting those who still live with the blank ache of disappearance, urging that citizen hobbyists, magnet fishers, journalists, and quiet archivists recognize themselves as part of one chain of accountability. It is not glamorous work. It will not end with a courtroom drama or a dramatic confession. But it is steady, the kind of effort that teaches institutions to reflect the best of the people who pressure them, not merely the inertia of those who staff them. And yet, no amount of procedural repair solves the deeper current: silence versus revelation. That struggle does not resolve. It behaves like the tide, retreating, returning, shaping the coast of our collective memory in slow, relentless increments. Some truths arrive too late to prosecute, some arrive too raw to integrate, and some remain in their boxes because the living decide that opening them would wound more than heal. On my desk I keep the image of the key. Water-scarred, stubborn, unimpressive in its weight, yet impossible to discard. It reminds me that truth travels strange, circuitous routes to surface, through rivers, through strangers' hands, through decades of delay. Its survival is an argument against despair. What is submerged is not always gone. My mother folds my uncle's letter back into its envelope and places it in a drawer I will not be invited to open. That, too, is an ending. Justice in this form is tempered by privacy. Closure arrives not with a gavel, but with the decision to leave some chambers sealed. We do not open every box simply because we can. Some lockers remain locked, and perhaps that is how history breathes, half revealed, half withheld, always asking us what we can bear to know,